The humid night air over Charleston pressed down like a wool blanket as I stood frozen at the bottom of my own staircase. Marcus was hauling his girlfriend's luggage through my hallway like he owned the place, which he certainly believed he did. Serena leaned against the railing above, draped in my late mother's silk kimono, wearing a smile that belonged to someone who had already won. Marcus pointed toward the front door and told me, without looking up, that it was time for me to go. Before I could find a single word to respond with, a low rumble moved through the quiet neighborhood street. 4 identical dark SUVs rolled slowly into my driveway, headlights cutting through the magnolia trees like a statement. Marcus went completely pale. This midnight removal was nothing more than the final chapter of a story that had been written long before I ever noticed the ink. The real turning point had happened the afternoon before, when I came home early from a client consultation to find my home office completely unrecognizable. My drafting table, the one covered in project files and color samples from a decade of work, building my interior design firm from nothing, was buried under shopping bags and takeout containers. Serena was lounging in my chair, scrolling through her phone, sipping sparkling water from my mother's crystal glasses without a flicker of shame. She did not startle when I walked in. She simply glanced up at me the way someone looks at a delivery person who has arrived at an inconvenient time. When Marcus came through the door 30 minutes later, I braced myself for some form of human decency. What I received instead was a single rusted car key slid across my kitchen counter. He told me, without ever meeting my eyes, that Serena needed the newer vehicle for her health and comfort. He suggested I use the old one we kept for hauling equipment. He spoke to me like a department head dismissing an underperforming intern. He asked me to gather my things without making a scene, framing his cruelty as a reasonable logistical arrangement. The anger that moved through me in that moment was not hot or loud. It was ice cold and perfectly focused. I stood there looking at that rusted key and felt something inside me complete a final calculation. This was not heartbreak. This was an audit. For years, I had been the silent financial and emotional backbone of a life that Marcus had built almost entirely on my foundation. I had absorbed his shortfalls, covered his gaps, and told myself that patience and consistency would eventually be recognized and returned. That is the most dangerous lie a giving person can tell themselves. When someone slowly and deliberately erodes your boundaries over a long period of time, you stop noticing the erosion. They normalize their behavior by making each demand feel slightly more reasonable than the last. You begin accepting less because less has been redefined as enough. You take the rusted key because you have been quietly convinced that the better vehicle was never yours to begin with. They drain you in increments small enough to avoid triggering your alarm, but large enough to leave you completely hollow by the time you realize what has happened. Marcus and Serena had not stumbled into this situation emotionally. They had executed it with the confidence of people who had already decided I lacked the resources or the backbone to push back. They expected me to cry. They expected me to bargain and negotiate from a position of desperation. They had done the math on my vulnerability and concluded that my value was entirely dependent on Marcus choosing to keep me around. Their math was catastrophically wrong. I set the rusted key on the counter and walked back upstairs without a single word. Panic was not something I could afford in that moment, and I had never been the type to spend energy I did not have. I packed my 7-month-old son with calm, deliberate precision, organizing every essential item with the same focused efficiency I used to manage renovation timelines and contractor budgets. I retrieved every important document from my filing cabinet, moving through the room like someone closing down a job site, ensuring nothing of value was left behind for the wrong people to access. When I walked out of that front door, with my son secured against my chest, Marcus was still standing in the driveway, staring at the 4 dark SUVs idling behind my car. The lead driver stepped out and opened the rear door of the first vehicle without a word. I did not look back at Marcus or the woman wearing my mother's kimono. I simply settled my son into his seat and stepped inside and pulled the door closed. The convoy left the neighborhood in clean, unhurried formation. My Uncle Bernard is not a man who deals in sentiment. He built a regional construction and land development empire over 40 years through discipline, precision, and an almost frightening ability to read leverage in any situation. When the vehicles crossed the county line and pulled up to his property outside the city, I felt the shift immediately. I was no longer standing on ground that Marcus had claimed. I was standing on ground that my family had built. His estate manager, a quiet and dependable woman named Gloria, who had managed the property for over 2 decades, was waiting at the entrance. She took my son without needing to be asked, carrying him inside with the practiced calm of someone who understood that practical support mattered more than words in moments like this. I walked directly into my uncle's study. Bernard was already seated behind his desk, a thick folder open in front of him, and a glass of bourbon waiting across from him. He was 63 years old and had the kind of stillness that comes from having navigated genuine high-stakes situations his entire career. We did not exchange lengthy emotional processing. We exchanged information. He told me that before the vehicles had even arrived at my house, he had already deployed 2 financial investigators to begin reviewing Marcus's investment activities. He showed me the preliminary documents across the desk lamp without ceremony. I understood immediately what kind of family I came from. Not the kind that offers soft reassurances, but the kind that builds walls before the storm arrives. Marcus launched his counteroffensive by the following morning. My phone filled with messages cycling between hollow apologies and barely veiled threats as his attempts at emotional manipulation found no audience. When private pressure produced no response, he moved the conflict into public territory, posting a carefully written account on social media, framing himself as a devoted partner abandoned by an emotionally unstable wife following the stress of new parenthood. It was a precise and calculated narrative designed to put me in a defensive position, forcing me to argue against his version of events in a public forum where emotions, rather than evidence, would determine credibility. I did not engage with a single word of it. Instead, seated at my uncle's conference table with his legal team arranged around me, I treated Marcus not as a wounded former partner, but as a compromised financial entity requiring immediate containment. The investigators presented their findings methodically over the next several hours. Marcus had not simply been neglecting his own investment fund. He had been using my design firm's operating accounts as a concealed buffer to cover his fund's mounting losses, quietly siphoning my working capital to keep his investors from discovering the depth of his mismanagement. The luxury image he maintained, the tailored wardrobe, the private dinners, the expensive car he had just reassigned to Serena, was a performance funded almost entirely by my business revenue. He had used my work to purchase his credibility. The response was immediate and without sentiment. My legal team filed emergency injunctions before the afternoon was finished. Every joint account was frozen. His access to my business credit lines was permanently revoked. His supplementary cards were canceled. Every financial connection between his operations and my assets was severed with clean finality. We did not leave him a single thread to pull. Marcus had operated for years under the assumption that I would continue absorbing his financial irregularities to preserve our shared stability and avoid the disruption of confrontation. He expected a phone call from me begging to find a workable compromise. What he received instead were a series of automated bank notifications informing him that his transactions were being declined. I watched the confirmation screens update across my laptop without feeling anything except the quiet clarity of someone who has finally stopped pretending a problem does not exist. The decisive development arrived 48 hours into the containment process. My lead attorney entered the study and placed a single document on the table. It was a verified record of a fraudulent transfer in the amount of $3,800,000. Marcus had forged my authorization signature to access the protected trust account I had established for my son's long-term financial security. He had stolen from his own child to cover his exposure. That document changed the nature of everything. This was no longer a marital dispute to be resolved through mediation and asset division. This was a federal criminal matter. By targeting the trust account, Marcus had removed every remaining pathway to a negotiated resolution. Whatever grief I might have still been carrying for the version of him I once believed in was replaced entirely by the absolute certainty that this would end in a courtroom. At the same moment, my uncle's investigator delivered a second piece of information that reframed the entire situation. Serena was not simply a younger woman Marcus had developed feelings for. She was a contracted operative. Her verified financial records showed consistent payments from Marcus's primary business competitor deposited into a secondary account, compensating her for an ongoing effort to destabilize his fund from within by deepening his personal and financial recklessness. The pregnancy she had used as the justification for my removal from my own home was entirely fabricated. There was no medical documentation to support it at any stage. Marcus had believed he was acquiring a devoted partner while conducting a power transfer. He was actually a manipulated instrument being used by a competitor to accelerate his own collapse. He had traded his family, his integrity, and ultimately his freedom for a carefully constructed illusion. This is the inevitable outcome for people who build their identity entirely on the appearance of strength, rather than its substance. When the performance requires borrowed resources and external validation to continue, it is not strength at all. It is a liability dressed in confidence, and liabilities eventually come due. The annual business leadership dinner, hosted at the most prestigious venue in the city, represented the moment of public reckoning. Marcus arrived attempting to project complete composure, introducing Serena to the room with the energy of someone determined to rewrite the narrative before anyone else could. He needed those investors. He needed that room to believe in him. At precisely 9:15, I walked through the main doors. I did not enter with apology in my posture or uncertainty in my expression. I wore my grandmother's pearl and garnet brooch, a piece that carried specific meaning within certain circles of our city's professional community, signaling without a single spoken word that my family's full resources were positioned behind me. The room noticed immediately. Marcus noticed immediately. The composure he had been projecting began to fracture in real time as I walked directly toward the presentation stage. He moved to intercept me and was quietly redirected by two members of Bernard's security team before he reached me. I stepped to the podium, acknowledged the room, and nodded to the audiovisual technician. The promotional content on the large display screens cut out and was replaced by two columns of financial documentation projected in complete clarity for the entire room to read. On one side, the forged transfer authorization bearing his clumsy imitation of my signature. On the other, Serena's verified payment records showing transfers from his competitors' holding accounts. The room was absolutely silent. I did not raise my voice or perform distress. I simply presented the factual record of what had occurred and allowed the people in that room to draw their own conclusions. Serena's response was instantaneous, recognizing that her operation had been fully exposed and that remaining associated with Marcus now represented significant legal risk to herself. She stepped away from him with visible calculation, loudly providing her own account of his behavior to the nearest cluster of guests, before retrieving her bag and walking out of the room without looking back at him. Marcus stood alone beneath the chandeliers with his investors already reaching for their phones to contact their own legal representation. He had nothing left to offer that room. No capital, no credibility, no story that held together under basic scrutiny. He was completely isolated in the center of the space he had entered, hoping to reclaim his standing, and the room watched without sympathy as law enforcement arrived to serve the warrant. He dropped to his knees before the officers reached him, asking for mercy, for a private resolution, for another chance. I met his eyes from across the room and offered him nothing except the steady gaze of someone who had finished grieving a long time ago. 14 months after that evening, the legal process has concluded and settled into history. Marcus received an 8-year federal sentence for forgery and financial fraud. Every misappropriated dollar was recovered and returned. My design firm operates exclusively under my direction and has expanded significantly in the period since. My son is healthy and growing up inside a home where security is not conditional and love is not something he has to earn. This morning, I'm sitting on the side porch of my uncle's property, watching the light move across the garden in long, quiet stripes. There is no performance required out here. No version of myself I need to maintain for anyone else's comfort. I spent years operating at a loss I refused to name, investing patience and resources into a relationship that was quietly cataloging my contributions and returning nothing of substance. The most costly thing I ever did was continue funding a connection that had already decided I was expendable. Leaving did not feel like strength in the moment. It felt like free fall. But the ground I landed on was entirely my own, and nothing built on it since has required anyone else's permission to stand. If you are reading this while carrying the weight of a situation that drains more than it returns, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not obligated to remain the financial and emotional resource for someone who treats your generosity as a structural weakness. The discomfort of walking away from what no longer serves you is temporary. The peace of belonging fully to yourself is permanent. Stop paying the toll on a road that was never leading anywhere worth going. Your value does not require their acknowledgement to be real. Protect it accordingly.